Howdy. Welcome to the Texas A&M University College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences Peer Program's STEM Education Series. Today, Dr. Carly Patterson will present Chew on This, Monogastrics and Hindgut Fermenters. Mammals such as horses and rabbits have digestive systems similar to our own, and yet, unlike us, their diet primarily consists of forage. Why is it that they can process this roughage and we cannot? Dr. Patterson will describe the unique anatomical and physiological differences in these animals which enable this process and which further classify these animals as hindgut fermenters. She'll also compare hindgut fermenters to simple monogastrics like ourselves. Welcome, Dr. Patterson.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here this morning to talk a little bit about the differences between monogastric digestion as well as hindgut digestion. And as Tori just pointed out, there are a lot of similarities that we can discuss, but there are some really important differences that we'll want to take a look at as well. And for all of you, those of you interested in a career in human medicine or veterinary medicine, there's a lot of really fascinating takeaways that help us understand how things work and then ultimately help us decide how we can help those who are having problems with their digestion, whether it's humans or cats or dogs or horses, whatever the species may be. So let's get started with an introduction to monogastric and hindgut digestion. So first, if we're going to start with our definitions, as it's always best to do, we'll go through what are monogastric animals. So monogastric animals have a simple stomach, or really one chamber. So mono referring to one, gastric referring to the stomach, one stomach. And monogastric animals have a really limited ability to digest fiber or cellulose as compared to ruminant animals. And when we talk about ruminant animals, we're thinking about our cows, our goats, our sheep, so animals that you might see out grazing on grass in the pasture. So those are our ruminant species. So based on that above description of a monogastric animal, let's think about a couple of different animal species that you think might be monogastric animals, and then maybe talk amongst yourselves or your neighbor to think about which ones those might be. So I hope everybody has one in their head about what might be a monogastric animal. So we have people, we have horses, we have pigs, we have dogs, cute little lab puppies. We have chickens, cats. And thinking about all of those, sorry, I advanced a little bit too quickly, but all of those are actually monogastric animals. So they have one simple stomach. And again, as we're going to talk about, there are some really important differences between all of those different animal species, but ultimately they have one big common thing, which is one stomach. Okay, so moving on to a little bit of the basics of a hindgut fermenter. That is going to be actually a modified monogastric animal. So like we said, there's that big broad category of monogastric, one stomach, and then we can take it down a little bit further into more details to say, well, some animals have more modifications that help us classify them according to the type of food they eat. So when we're talking about modified monogastric animals like hindgut fermenters, they're actually going to be the animals that we think about as herbivores. So they're adapted to eat a lot of forages like grass and hay. And again, they have a really extensive part of their large intestine called the cecum that allows them to process these different types of plant materials that we might see them commonly eating, again, out in the pasture. And again, the cecum is something that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail when we go through the specific parts of the gastrointestinal tract, but it's this modification or adaptation of the cecum that allows these hindgut fermenters to be such efficient herbivores. Another important distinction about hindgut fermenters is that they have an odd number of toes. So thinking about 1, 3, or 5 as far as the number of toes they have. So again, going back to what we did with our monogastrics, thinking about a couple of different animal species that might be hindgut fermenters and kind of keep those in the back of your head. So we have horses, we have rhinoceros, elephants, so rabbits, and of course a sloth, which might not be one that we commonly see every day, but again, a fun one to think about. And then a zebra, again, another relative of the horse. And so when we're thinking about these species, again, realizing they still have one stomach, but they have specialized adaptations, especially when it comes to their large intestine, that allow them to process fiber a lot better than you and I can. And thinking about horses and rabbits in particular, again, as species that might have underlying medical problems relating to their digestive tract, it's really important to understand why their hindgut fermentation happens the way it does, because that allows us, again, to help treat their medical problems without doing any additional harm to their gastrointestinal tract. So again, a really important understanding of the physiology behind their digestion that, again, allows us to help them when they start to feel sick. Okay, so we had a lot of different terms and a lot of different species that we just kind of threw out into the mix and said there are a lot of different important adaptations. So before we get really into a lot of the nitty-gritty details, let's just clarify to make sure that we're all on the same page. So first of all, if we're breaking down the broad category of types of digestion, we have the two different branches we can think about. We have monogastric digestion, which again is our focus for today, and then we have ruminant digestion. And as you can see, there's a picture of a cow right there to illustrate, again, cows, goats, they're going to be in their own category as far as their type of digestion. So again, we're not going to talk about ruminants today because that's an entirely other subject that would take a whole nother hour or so to discuss. But we're going to really focus on monogastric digestion and then take a closer look at hindgut fermenters. So again, to outline, we're going to focus on monogastrics, so people, dogs, cats, pigs, all of those good species, and then talking about the hindgut fermenters, especially horses and rabbits, as the ones that have really important distinctions. There is avian digestion, but we're not going to really touch on that so much today. Okay, so again, the big overarching theme here is that the hindgut fermenters, so our horses, again, they're still monogastric animals, but they have these extensive modifications that make them able to, again, adapt to a very forage-heavy diet. Okay, so again, and just to emphasize, there are many species that fall under each category, but these are the big ones that we're going to talk about today. All right, so let's just take a closer look at some of the specific organs of the gastrointestinal tract and figure out how their specific adaptations enable all of us, whether it's a horse, a cat, a dog, a pig, a human, enable us to eat our food and absorb the nutrients and ultimately digest it so that we have energy to go about our day. So again, the gastrointestinal tract is a wonderfully complex system, and there's more and more that we're discovering each and every day about all of the different complex interactions that happen on the cellular level. So again, a really vast world out there, and we're going to just start from the beginning to talk about what happens when we start to think about, eating a nice meal, or this horse that's reaching down to graze some grass in the pasture. So first, we have to start with prehension and mastication. So what exactly do we mean by that? So basically, we're talking about what is going to happen with the mouth, and more specifically, the lips and the teeth. And again, every animal species is going to look slightly different in terms of their overall anatomy and how many teeth they have or how their lips are shaped in order to adapt to their specific diet. And so when we're talking about prehension, that is where we are talking about the physical act of gathering food and moving it into the mouth. And so really in monogastric animals, this is going to be their teeth and their lips. And there's a nice close-up picture here of a horse, and hopefully you can appreciate just how developed their lips and their teeth are, again, to reach down and grab those blades of grass. You can also appreciate some of the nature of the rabbit lips on that next picture, again, trying to grab that piece of plant there and really start the process of digestion. So moving on from prehension, so again, trying to just physically gather that food up and move it to the mouth, we then have the act of mastication, where we are chewing the food into smaller particles. And so this is the grinding and the chewing action of the teeth themselves. And again, this is going to depend on the species that we're talking about and the specific foodstuffs that we're relating to, because again, our teeth don't look like rabbit teeth, and those rabbit teeth don't look like a horse's teeth either. So again, all slightly different, but it depends on the type of food that we're eating. And so then we are starting this process of digestion, and so we need some enzymes to help break down some of those food particles into smaller pieces that can actually be used by the body. So we don't have to wait until food gets into the stomach or the small intestine to start that enzymatic digestion. We actually have some enzymes in our mouth that will help break down those food particles. And so salivary amylase is going to be the enzyme that we'll refer to in the mouth as, again, one of those enzymes to help break down those food particles. So again, we're just at the beginning here, getting the food ready. It hasn't even been transported all the way through the gastrointestinal tract yet. It's just we're getting it ready for that journey. So getting back to our picture of the horse as far as orientation with all of the different organs of the gastrointestinal tract, let's move on and talk about the esophagus. The esophagus, as you can see outlined in red here, is a pretty big structure in the horse. So again, all of our species are going to be slightly different, have slightly different anatomic modifications, so that certainly our esophagus is not as long as the esophagus as in a horse, as in a cat, as in a dog, etc., etc. But let's talk in broad terms about what the esophagus does. So it's basically a hollow tube that's going to connect the mouth to the stomach. So it's going to be very important for, again, getting food to move its way through the gastrointestinal tract and ultimately be taken up by the intestines for additional absorption. So the esophagus is really important, again, for these smooth muscle contractions that help propel food down the esophagus and towards the stomach. So these specific contractions, we often refer to them as peristaltic waves. And again, that's just referring to those muscular contractions that move the food from your mouth into your stomach. And a really important point that brings up a nice clinical correlation here is the fact that we want that movement to only go in one direction. We want the food to move from the mouth into the stomach. Otherwise, if food wasn't allowed to go in multiple different directions, then potentially the food could move from your esophagus back through your mouth, and that would be the physical act of vomiting, which, you know, when you don't feel well and you feel like you're going to be sick and you're going to throw up, that's never a great feeling. And so we don't want that to happen on a daily basis. And so again, when we have animals that are presented to us as veterinarians in the clinic for something like vomiting, a lot of the times we actually will investigate whether their esophagus is working properly, because sometimes problems with that movement can manifest as vomiting. A really important fun fact, again, that brings in these special nuances between monogastric animals and hindgut fermenters is the fact that horses physically cannot vomit, and that's due to the angle at which their esophagus connects to their stomach and the relative strength of their sphincter muscle. So we'll go into that a little bit more with some of these different organs. But again, these are strong muscles that control the size of the opening into the gastrointestinal tract organs. So again, that's something that our veterinary students will learn very early on, because when we're talking to an owner for a cat and a dog, we might ask them if they've noticed any vomiting. And again, that's an important distinction. However, when we're talking to a person who owns a horse, we're not going to ask them if their horse has been vomiting, because we know that physically horses cannot vomit. So again, just an important distinction where understanding the physiology behind these different species helps you to figure out how to narrow down problems when they might arise. So again, something, just a fun fact to keep thinking about.
So that fun fact, of course, brings the question, what happens when a horse is sick or has something in their stomach that shouldn't be there?
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question. It's a very, very relevant question. And so when horses are sick, especially if they're sick relating to their gastrointestinal tract, we actually get very, very concerned, because their intestinal tract, again, is so specialized, and it's, as you'll see, it's very, very long. And so sometimes they can actually have portions of the intestinal tract twist on itself, and we refer to that as colic. So a lot of the times when they're sick because of their intestinal tract, they'll sometimes paw at their belly, or they'll start rolling around on the ground, or they will start sweating. Maybe they're not eating, or they're not defecating or going to the bathroom as they should. And so all of those are going to be really big red flags in terms of a horse acting sick. And as you've noted, vomiting would not be part of that manifestation. So again, really, really important, and we take it very seriously. It's just very different than what we would see in a dog or a cat. All right, great question. So moving on from the esophagus, we'll then talk a little bit about the stomach. So again, let's see where the stomach is in this horse. So you can see and hopefully appreciate that it's a little bit folded up on itself. And again, that's how it will be for the different species, just depending on the relative size of the stomach. So the stomach, when we're talking about monogastrics, and again, we know that our hindgut fermenters are monogastrics as well, but we're going to look at the pig and the human stomach in these visuals before we take a look at the horse stomach. So the stomach of the monogastrics is going to have a really low pH, and that's going to be very important to help destroy most harmful bacteria and break down food. So this is important because we're breaking down the food, but this is actually not where nutrient absorption takes place. So you might think that's where it's happening, because again, we think about eating a delicious meal, the food goes into our stomach, we feel pretty full, but that's not where we're absorbing our food. That's going to be really our small intestines are doing a majority of that. So the stomach is very important for this mechanical mixing of food, breaking it down into smaller particles, again, so that it can be absorbed later on down the line through the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. And we have some of this churning action. There are a bunch of different movements that, again, help break the food apart into more digestible particulate matter. And so hopefully you can appreciate the fact that the pig stomach looks very similar to the human stomach, just from its overall anatomy, the size, the shape. There's a number of different folds there. Again, that's going to be very important of just moving food through the gastrointestinal tract. So Just take a look at that. And then when we're talking about the horse stomach, again, still a monogastric animal, but we're specifically talking about horses as hindgut fermenters. So the horse stomach is unique in that there's a glandular and a non-glandular area. And so it's what we refer to as partially glandular, in that only some of the areas of the horse stomach actually secrete those enzymes to break down food. And a big problem that we might see in our horses is actually developing gastrointestinal ulcers in the non-enzymatic region of the stomach. Again, it's very similar in function to the other monogastrics. It's just unique in that we have this actual demarcation between the two regions in the horse stomach. So I've just highlighted a few areas here where we have this non-glandular and this glandular area, and there's actually a specific line called the margo plicatus. It sounds like a person's name that delineates these two sections, and something where you can actually see a visible difference between the two if you were to examine, a preserved specimen of the horse stomach. So again, slight difference. It's going to be important when we talk about, again, clinical manifestations of problems and then the way different animals adapt to their food material.
So Randall Middle School would like to know, since you've showed us these differences in horses, are there foods that horses, and I guess by definition hindgut fermenters in general, are there foods that they cannot eat?
So that's a great question. So again, cannot is a pretty strong word. I would say there's more of things that they're better adapted to eat. So again, we're talking more about forage type material. They're not very well adapted to the heavy meat or grain diet that we might have in, our human populations or our cat or dog population. So again, it's not so much things that they cannot eat, but more things that they're better equipped to deal with. So, and again, that gets into more of the issues with the large intestine, because we want to keep that very, very happy at all times, because again, if that develops a problem, then the horse can be in serious trouble. So good question. All right, so talking a little bit about enzymes. So we're going to be thinking again of, we have all of this food material that enters into the gastrointestinal tract. So how do we get it into maybe that cheeseburger format that you're going to eat for lunch into something that the small intestine can ultimately use for energy later in the day? So we have a lot of different enzymes that are going to be produced by the animal to help aid that digestive process. And so these are very, very important when we're talking about breaking down these really big molecules into smaller ones that can be used by the animal on an everyday basis. So there's a nice little moving graphic here of a pair of scissors, and so you can think of these enzymes as little scissors to kind of, again, chop up the pieces from really big into really small, and again, able to be used by the animal. So there's also a nice little schematic here looking at large molecules like a big Mario here, and then we have our little enzymes in the arrow to break that big Mario into a small Mario, and so that he can be absorbed. And again, this goes back into these clinical correlations. When we have problems with enzymes, then we might see that manifested in our animals as far as they're not able to properly absorb their nutrients. So maybe they're eating a lot of food, but they're ultimately not gaining weight or losing weight because their body physically cannot process that food because of a lack of enzymes. And so again, that's just a way of applying that physiology to say, okay, I know what's supposed to be happening, but now I see that there's a problem, so I'm going to reason through what might be the underlying cause to best figure out where to go next. And again, that's a really important tool in the mindset of any kind of physician, again, treating humans, treating animals. Anything that you might see is being able to think of how things should work normally, because then it again helps you understand when things are abnormal. Okay, so let's get into some parts of the small intestine, and it's probably difficult to fully appreciate in this horse diagram because it's a relatively, small bunching, but as you'll see, these intestines are a lot longer than we might think. They just happen to be coiled up in the animal's abdomen, and that goes for everybody, us included. Okay, so the small intestine is going to be really, really important for, again, absorbing nutrients. So like we said, the stomach, we're not actually absorbing our nutrients there, we're just physically breaking down the food so that it can move through a sphincter into the small intestine and ultimately continue this absorptive process. And so this is something that actually, in terms of the small intestine, the function will be the same between the monogastric species, our hindgut fermenters, and ruminant animals. So again, ruminants are in their own class as far as the number of chambers or stomachs that they might have in their specialized diet. Hindgut fermenters, as you can tell from the name, their large intestine, their hindgut, so their lower half of the intestines is going to be really important. And then monogastrics, again. So a lot of distinctions, but a lot of overlap as well. The duodenum, or that first part of the small intestine, is going to be really important for, again, continuing this enzymatic digestion. We have a lot of really important enzymes, especially from the pancreas, that will get to the duodenum and help break down food. And like I said before, this is where we might see some problems. If the pancreas doesn't make these enzymes, then we have a lot of problems with food as it moves through the small intestine. It doesn't get absorbed properly. Then we have the jejunum, which is a really long part of the small intestine to, again, absorb nutrients. And we have a lot of villi. And let's pause for a moment and talk about these villi, because this is the first time we're seeing them in the gastrointestinal tract. So we have a couple of different images on the screen that you can see. One is actually a picture of the villi as they might look under the microscope. So I hope you can appreciate the really long, almost finger-like projections. They're outlined in purple. And basically, the reason that they are so long and finger-like and structured ultimately like a really tall shag carpet with a lot of the different fibers poking out is because that helps really maximize absorption of nutrients, but it also contains the small intestine within a certain space constraint. So we really have a limited surface area, but we can maximize that absorption. So if we didn't have these villi, your small intestine would probably be a zillion times bigger, and it wouldn't be as efficient. So these really small finger-like projections are very, very important when we talk about nutrient absorption because, again, we can maximize the space in the small intestine to get the most out of that meal that you've just eaten. And again, this is another important clinical correlation when we're talking about disease processes because some gastrointestinal viruses can actually destroy the villi, and so you're not able to absorb your food as well. And again, you might be eating a lot, but you still lose weight, or you still feel hungry, or you have some other aspect of really not feeling well because you're not getting the most from your food. And this is something that we see in our dogs and cats as well, especially with some illnesses that, again, can really take out the villi of the small intestine. A really common one that we see in dogs is the canine parvovirus infection, where young puppies, if they're not vaccinated or they get exposed to this virus, they'll begin vomiting a lot. They have really profuse diarrhea, and they're not able to absorb their food well. So again, a really important and common disease process that we see that attacks the villi of the small intestine. So again, a super, super important area that we like to make sure is working well, because if it's not, then we can have really serious consequences. So the last part of the small intestine that we have is the ileum. that continues the nutrient absorption of the small intestine, and again is another specialized part of the small intestine. So we have the small intestine as a broad category, and then these three distinct parts that all have slightly different roles, and again, just the way our body has adapted to really be quite efficient in processing our food. Okay, so again, hopefully a little bit more of an understanding and appreciation for the small intestine, especially as it relates to the human. So thinking about our bodies and all those coils of small intestine that you have inside you, the small intestine is approximately 22 feet long if we were to stretch it out end to end in humans. So hopefully that gives you some appreciation for just how much work it's doing and how important, again, those villi are, because if we didn't have the villi, then our intestines would have to be even longer than that and probably couldn't even fit in our bodies. So again, very, very important, and it's a little bit deceiving when you think of, again, our sophisticated anatomy and the way that we can make everything fit into our bodies and still process everything quite well. Okay, thinking about the pig, so again, very different anatomy from you and me, just in the physical appearance. But when we get down into the inner workings, there's a lot of similarities. So we have our small intestine. Again, it's approximately 55 feet long in pigs. Again, quite a really long organ, and especially thinking about how it has to be coiled up in our pig species.
We have a quick question
All right.
here. They'd like to know, does the length of the small intestine impact the efficiency of absorption?
So that's a great question. So certainly the length of the small intestine, when it's functioning as it should be, obviously that's great and it's really helpful. However, there's some times when portion of the intestine has to be removed, whether it's because of disease or something else that's happened to cause compromise to the gastrointestinal tract. We actually can lose quite a bit of that small intestine without having too much of an impact. However, once we get down to really taking away, quite a bit of it, then we can see some problems, and there are some dietary modifications that we might have to make for our patients. So again, it's ideal to have it as long as it is. We can certainly make some adjustments and not necessarily be impacted too much, but again, there are certain points where we need that length and that capacity for absorption. Okay, so thinking again about our small intestine of the horse, our hindgut fermenter. So remember I said it was quite deceiving in that picture about the actual length of the small intestine. So in horses, it's approximately 70 feet, and hopefully from that bottom drawing, you can get a little bit of an appreciation for the many parts of the colon that go into the horse. So you can see there's right ventral colon, there's right dorsal colon, left ventral colon, left dorsal colon. And all of these, again, we name them because they're important parts of the anatomy, and it also helps to localize where we can have problems, again, with horses in their gastrointestinal tract. And there are actually certain drugs that when given to horses can cause problems in a very specific region of the colon. So again, important to know the anatomy. It's not just a nitpicky thing that we'll never use later in life. It actually very much applies to how we think about treating these animals in everyday situations. So thinking about the large intestines. So again, quite a lot of large intestine in the horse. They are hindgut fermenters, so they are going to have a very well adapted large intestine to handle the food that they eat on an everyday basis. So before we get into the horses, let's talk a little bit about humans. So you can see we have, again, a number of different anatomical features of the large intestine. So we have our ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, ultimately then it'll make its way out through the rectum. So again, talking about the gastrointestinal tract, we're moving from food, that's entered the mouth, making its way all the way through the large intestine. And so as you can see in this picture, there's a notation about the cecum of a human. And this is something, again, where we'll have a big difference with humans versus horses, because we do not have a very well-developed cecum. We're not very well adapted to digesting a lot of forage or a lot of grass, cellulose type material. And then this is something that also brings in an interesting fact about your appendix. And so we think that the appendix is maybe a remnant from a larger cecum. And if you've ever known anybody that's had appendicitis, they have a lot of pain in their abdomen, they go to the hospital, they determine that their appendix is inflamed or in trouble, and they ultimately have to go in and surgically remove the appendix, again, because we as humans can function just fine without this remnant, this appendix, because again of the way that our digestive system has adapted to eat the foods that we normally eat. So again, a big distinction when we start talking about the cecum and the history of the cecum in the human versus the history of the cecum in the horse.
We have a couple of other questions.
Okay.
All right. Miriam says that they learned about the tapeworm and how it can measure up to 60 feet long. Do animals get tapeworms as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, absolutely, animals get tapeworms. And so again, this is going to be a big problem that we see them in dogs and cats and horses. Definitely something that we want to look out for, because the tapeworm can impact the digestive and absorptive capacity of our gastrointestinal tract. So frequently what we will do is have deworming medications. So these are anti-parasite medications that go in and help to kill the tapeworm so that they are not impacting our animal species and hindering their ability to absorb their food. So yes, absolutely, tapeworms can be a big problem and something that we want to think about if we have an animal that's maybe having some digestive problems. So very good question.
And then I have one more, and they'd like to know what would happen if a human or other simple monogastric ate the same diet as a hindgut fermenter?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So again, if you were to start to eat a lot of this plant material and really think about the magnitude of what horses eat in a day, pounds of grass and other cellulose type material, again, you would probably feel very bloated and very sick after not a whole lot of it, because again, our bodies are just not capable of eating such large volumes within a really short period of time. So again, we know that plants and vegetables and fruit, those are all good parts of the human diet. But again, thinking about how we eat them and in what form and how often we eat them, it's going to be very different than what horses are eating on a daily basis. And as you've noted, horses are continuously eating and continuously moving things through their GI tract, and that's essential for their normal function, whereas us as humans, we don't have to eat constantly. Maybe sometimes you feel hungry constantly, but we don't have to be eating constantly to keep things happy in our digestive tract. So again, really nice questions about important distinctions. Okay. So getting into the large intestine of the pig, so again, just some fun facts about how the large intestine is approximately 17 feet long and can hold about 2.5 gallons. And then the cecum alone, as you can see, is pretty large in this picture, and that alone is 9.5 inches long. So this is where we get into some really, really important distinctions again with the horse, as we said, a hindgut fermenter. So the large intestine is approximately 24 feet long, and the cecum alone is about 4 feet long. And so this is where the large intestine, again, is shorter than the small intestine in the horse, but it's going to be critical for the digestive activities of the horse on a daily basis. And so that's again why we are so attuned to horses and their everyday gastrointestinal habits as far as, are they still eating? Are they still defecating, going to the bathroom in a normal fashion? Because if a horse stops eating or is not defecating, then we know we have a big problem, because in order for their digestive system and their large intestine to stay happy and absorb nutrients, we need to keep the food moving through their gastrointestinal tract. So again, a really important clinical consideration for anybody that has any kind of relationship with a horse, because we want to make sure that they keep moving about as they should. So this is something where hopefully you can appreciate some things that we just discussed as far as the big differences between horses and pigs. And so talking about the pig, hopefully you can see that the highlighted cecum is quite small. It's in a little bit of that yellow area, versus the horse has a really large cecum. And again, this is going to be relating back to this idea of where fermentation is taking place. And so let's talk about that a little bit more, is this large intestine idea. So after moving through the small intestine, food stuff is going to move into the large intestine. And this is, again, the big difference between monogastric species from our hindgut fermenters, as far as that specialized class of monogastrics. So again, while the function is essentially the same, our hindgut fermenters are going to be much more efficient in terms of processing these materials. And again, we're not even going to get into ruminants, because they're in an entirely different class of themselves. And so we have this cecum, which again is going to be the biggest difference between our monogastrics and our hindgut fermenters, because the cecum is where a lot of this fermentation is going to happen. And that's these microbial interactions that, again, are going to be really important for digesting nutrients in a really efficient process. So the cecum is essentially a blind pouch, and it's very well developed in our hindgut fermenters, again, to handle the type of food that they're eating on a daily basis. We ultimately have our colon, which is going to absorb a lot of the water before food, leftover waste particles leave the body, and then ultimately the rectum, where waste will leave the body so that it is not, again, sitting there impeding everyday function. Okay, so again, getting into the big difference of why we are not able to handle a lot of plant material, really a large volume in a given period of time, and that's because the hindgut fermenters have really nice adaptations for digesting fiber. And so these microbes that are in the large intestine will really utilize these microbial populations to break down the fiber in a very efficient manner. And so we know that our hindgut fermenters are very efficient. Our ruminants are even more efficient when talking about these microbes and fermentation, which is, again, you're seeing your animals like cows and goats constantly eating, constantly breaking down that plant material. And so again, in our non-ruminant animals, this microbial protein is not digested as well, just because of the location of that fermentation. So again, specialized adaptations that help everybody digest their food in a really efficient manner. So if we think about it a little bit more, why it would be beneficial for an herbivore to be a hindgut fermenter rather than a monogastric, then we can take it to say because of this fermentation capability. So basically they can digest their fiber much more effectively than a monogastric. So they're out there in the pasture, they have access to all this grass, they can actually use it, and so it makes much more sense for herbivores to have this superior fermentation capacity. And so, again, the food that they eat has a high cellulose content. We need these microbes, we need fermentation in order to break it down. And so, again, the herbivores can really digest a higher percentage of their food source, and so that's why they have these requirements versus us and humans don't have those same requirements. And we might, not feel as well if we eat a bunch of it in the same way a horse would. Okay, so talking a little bit about this fermentation now that we've brought it up, again, it's this digestion process that's utilized by the large intestine. And it's going to occur in an environment in which there is no oxygen. So that's termed anaerobic. And this is where we have these microbes, which basically different good bacteria that can ultimately break down the food. And so this is where we have a nice relationship between the microbe that gets a place to live, and then the animal, the host animal, gets some benefit out of these tenants that it has because these microbes will do a job in exchange for living in this host animal. And so again, this helps the animal to be very efficient in breaking down their food source. And again, it's important to have this population of these so-called good bacteria because they actually are doing a really important job. So we don't want there to be a complete absence of bacteria. We want to make sure the good ones are there doing their job, and we want to make sure the harmful ones that are not helping this process stay out of the GI tract. And then ultimately, like we've touched on, fermentation is going to be most efficient in ruminants. Again, we did not discuss their specialized adaptations. It's then next most efficient in hindgut fermenters like our horses, and then it's least efficient in the monogastric animals. So again, a really important spectrum of how different animals are going to break down their food sources and be able to take all of that energy in. And so thinking about the species that would most rely on fermentation based solely on the anatomy, so again, thinking back to where does fermentation occur, where in the gastrointestinal tract, and thinking specifically to the large intestine, hopefully there's one organ on here that's really standing out and giving you the answer to this question. And so, based on that, hopefully you can see that the horse, again, would rely most on fermentation because of its cecum. So you can see how big the cecum is relative to the pig, relative to the human, and again, it makes sense because that's where the fermentation is occurring. So in summary, when we're talking about our monogastric digestion, again, we've talked about a number of really important similarities and a number of differences. And so we can think about the different organs of the gastrointestinal tract, the type of digestion process that's happening, the different types of lining, the cells that are going on in that particular organ, and then ultimately we can think about how efficient these specific animals would be. So again, thinking about fermentation and where it happens in the large intestine, and so our ruminants are going to be most efficient in terms of using fermentation than our hindgut fermenters, and then ultimately monogastrics. And so ultimately efficiency of digestion, ruminants will be most efficient, hindgut fermenters next, and our monogastrics last. So again, a lot of important distinctions and a lot of reasons why we don't eat the same diet that they do because we're really not very efficient in digesting it. All right, well, I think that is getting to the close of what we have to talk about. There are a couple of videos there that will just, go over a few more things, but we've touched on a lot of good points. And so if we think about wrapping it up, we can think about which type of diet would best suit the two types of digestive systems that you've seen today. So we have our monogastric digestion and our hindgut fermenters. And I think a lot of you have been very astute in your questions and already coming to thinking about this answer. And so again, you've already pointed this out. Our monogastric animals are best suited for diets high in concentrates like grain or meat that have a relatively low fiber concentration, easy to break down by enzymes. We can get some energy and move about our day, as opposed to our hindgut fermenters because they are really well suited to digesting a lot of plant material, fiber, things that come in forage because of this hindgut fermentating capability. So again, coming back into what's the most efficient type of food for these animals, and then that helps us design the ideal diet because we know we can't feed horses a bunch of steaks or a bunch of grain because then ultimately they're not going to be able to utilize that very effectively. All right, I think that is all we have today, and I thank you for your attention.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Patterson. It's very interesting and helps us to understand not only the physiology, anatomy, but kind of why we eat the way we do and why we feed our animals the way we do. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or other veterinary science or STEM-related materials, we invite you to visit our website. It's peer.tamu.edu. And in fact, this particular presentation is available on our website if you'd like to take this into your classroom. It includes some videos and even a little experiment that your students can do. We look forward to seeing you at the end of this month when Dr. Jeffrey Musser will present Bugs in Your Blood, Malaria. Until then, we hope you have a great day.